Well, good morning. I'm glad you joined me today to go over our review of what we read this week and our challenge to go through the Bible in 1 year. So by now you're probably asking, why does God put up with these people? And in spite of all their stubbornness, in spite of all their disobedience, he still calls them his people, his special people. Not because they deserved it, mind you, but so they can be a channel of his blessing to all people through the Messiah, just the way he promised Abraham so many years ago. And however, it did require punishment and some suffering, but God never abandons them. We'll start in the Old Testament. We're still in 1 Samuel. We left off with King Saul, and it's the beginning of the end for Saul. As you'll recall, Samuel the prophet has already told Saul that because of his disobedience, his kingdom would come to an end, and that in fact that God has already found his replacement, a man after God's own heart. God even said he was sorry he made Saul king. Now, he wasn't confessing a mistake, but he was expressing sorrow for the people. Now, Saul is still king, and he's doing a miserable job of it. Not because he lacked ability, but because he forgot God. He does not have control over his men. They're afraid to attack, and he shows authority by threatening to withhold food. And apparently he had very little communication with his own son Jonathan, who along with one of his companions breaks camp one night and comes upon an enemy camp. And unlike his father, Jonathan was full of faith, and he knew that that enemy that they were looking at was no match for him and God. They charged the camp. God not only caused the enemy to scatter, but he created fear and panic, and it said that they were slaughtered as they ran. And in fact, his victory inspired other men to come out of hiding, join forces with Saul, and they were able to win the battle. And again, God spares Israel. So even after God said Saul's kingdom would come to an end, he still continues to have victories. Now, in case you're questioning that, remember that success is not limited only to godly people if it's within God's will. Saul's victory were not for him, but for the sake of God's people. He was a type of agent that God used to bring judgment on those who harmed his people. Well, with each victory, Saul's pride grows. Once after defeating the Amalekites, he even builds a monument to himself. And then he ignores God's destruction to completely destroy, and he decides to keep the plunder for himself. And you ask yourself, why would God ask them to completely destroy all of the people, the livestock, and everything? It was because he wanted everything removed that would cause even the least temptation to his people to return back to idolatry. Now, of course, Samuel was upset about this, and Saul, thinking he was pretty shrewd, came up with a good excuse. Well, I was going to use the plunder as a sacrifice to God. That's like saying, well, I only stole the money so I could give it to church. See, Saul's heart was on his own interest. It wasn't on God, of course. But Saul's excuses did not fool Samuel. And he said, listen, obedience is better than sacrifice. And if you hear these words, if they sound familiar to you, it's because you read them several times throughout the Bible, which tells us they're words that we should pay attention to. So now the identity of God's next king is about to be revealed. God sends Samuel to select the next king from one of the sons of a man named Jesse. And he has strict instructions. God says, don't judge by his appearance. I look at the heart. And wouldn't you know, the one that he selects is the one least likely. The baby of the family who's out tending sheep and goats. His name was David. So Saul secretly appoints David as king Samuel secretly appoints David as king because, remember, Saul is still legally king. And Scripture says the Spirit of God came upon him from that day on. And at the same time, we're told the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul, and God sends a tormenting spirit to him, causing him to be driven to madness and paranoia. So now God is bringing everything together. Saul is suffering deep depression and he's emotionally unstable. And the only thing that could cause this problem he was suffering was music. So he unknowingly hires David because of his musical skills. David was very good with the harp, and he's even later promoted to armor bearer because Saul really loved David at that time. So I guess you could say the harp player in the castle would soon own the castle. Well, Saul and his men, we find them in a 40-day standoff facing a different kind of enemy. It's a giant, a 9-foot, well-armed pagan giant shouting threats. And apparently Saul and his men forgot about everything that God had done for them before because they were holding back in fear. Now here's where David enters, not as a soldier, but as an errand boy from his dad's sin to take food out to the soldiers. And we see a little sibling rivalry going on here when his brothers taunt him and say, okay, you've done your job, now go home, you're a pest. But that didn't discourage him because David was so full of faith and confidence from all of those years that he spent out in the fields with the sheep fighting wild animals. He was even able to convince Saul to let him fight the giant. I guess Saul thought, what have you got to lose? So this is where a valuable lesson comes in, the power of perspective. You see, the giant looked at David, and he saw a boy with a stick and rocks in his hands to be annihilated. But he did not see the God of Israel who was with him. David, on the other hand, didn't see a giant that others feared, but he saw an overgrown pagan with a big mouth blaspheming God that needed to be taken down. And he used his simple tools, the slingshot and the stones, and he dropped the giant with it. And then it doesn't end there. He reached for the very sword that was meant to kill him and used it to finish off the giant. And by the way, the rest of the enemies fled in terror. Saul was so impressed with him that he wanted to know who he was. And so in case you're asking, now the previous chapter, it said that Saul had David as a musician to help him with his depression. So why is he now asking, who is this young man? Whose son is he? Now there's a couple of thoughts on that. Perhaps he is wanting to get to know his family because the reward for killing the giant was to marry his daughter. Or perhaps his mental condition had deteriorated so bad that he was unstable and didn't recognize him. So those are just some thoughts about that. Well, as it turns out, David becomes a great warrior, and he was successful in everything that he did because the Lord was with him. And the people loved him. They were applauding him, which caused Saul's appreciation for David to turn into insane jealousy. Because you see, he just wouldn't let go. In fact, he made several attempts to kill David. And then his own daughter, who David married, had to spare him one time and help him escape. And to make things worse, his own son Jonathan became very close friends with David and defended him. And this drove Saul to such anger that he even tried to kill his own son. But David and Jonathan had a very strong commitment to each other. They had a good relationship because it was based on their commitment to God. So Saul's mental and emotional instabilities are getting worse. When he abandoned God, the door was open for other voices, another spirit to fill him with thoughts of jealousy. He was suspicious. He was paranoid. His imagination went wild about conspiracies against him, even against his own family, his own men, and even his priest. He ordered 85 priests, plus their families and their livestock, to be killed. Now that was a heinous thing to do. And you just kind of have to ask yourself, when that happened, did the people say, hey, did we really want a king? You see, when you forget God, you're unable to rest in him, and your perceptions becomes distorted, and it gives the devil a foothold on your thoughts and your imaginations, and it can cause you to make some foolish decisions and overreactions. So David has to part for safety reasons. He builds an army out of misfits, and he goes into hiding from Saul, who wants to kill him. He even gets help from the Moabites. Now, the reason probably he got help from them, if you'll remember from previous reading, his great-grandmother was Ruth, who was from Moab. So on one occasion, Saul thought he had David trapped. And he thought, aha, God is still on my side. But you know, sometimes you want things so badly that you think that everything is a sign from God. But God protected him. On the other hand, David had opportunities to kill Saul, but he restrained himself and his men. And his men even tried to tell him that, oh, this has to be a sign from God. Sometimes well-meaning friends can give bad advice. Don't assume that others know God's will for you. Test that advice against God's word. David had no good reason to respect Saul, but he respected the God who made him king. And he knew that he was going to be king someday. So he rested in God's timing and let God handle Saul. So when Saul realizes that he's been spared, and by the way, so does everybody else, he publicly admits that he knows that David was going to succeed him as king. And he made David promise, just don't hurt my family. And David made that promise, and he kept it. Well, they didn't leave together. Saul and his men go home, and in the meantime, he gives David's wife to another man, and Samuel the prophet dies. But before you think David's perfect, we see him in a fit of rage take revenge when a wealthy man refuses to help him and his men. Now, he could have carried through with that, but the man's wife intercedes, and her name is Abigail. And she goes to David and pleads on behalf of her foolish husband. And so those things calm down there. But David must have really been impressed with Abigail, because when her husband dies, he ends up marrying her. And so we'll end there. And next week, we're going to see David rise to the position of king, but it's not going to be an easy journey. So let's move on to the New Testament. We're still in John. You'll recall that earlier we talked about how the writers in the Bible may talk about the same thing, but in a different perspective. So John seems to focus on the conflicts that seems to be going on during Jesus' ministry. The religious leaders at that time were corrupt. You see, they were appointed by the political leaders so they could have control over the people. And the more they see Jesus performing miracles and drawing crowds, the more threatened they felt. Now, some believed in him, and others thought he was a lunatic, and they wanted him arrested. They even tried to stone him, but they were never able to do so. Why? Because Jesus' time had not yet come. And some people were disappointed because they thought the Messiah that he claimed to be was going to be someone who was going to protect them and deliver them from the Romans. And Jesus explained, using something they all understood, why that some struggled with believing. He talked about raising sheep. He said, some of you can't believe because you're not my sheep. And sheep instinctively recognize the voice of the master or the shepherd because they know he'll protect them. If sheep hear any other voice, they know that it's a thief. And as Jesus said, a thief that comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And Jesus likened himself as a shepherd who was devoted to protect them. And see, shepherds also served as a type of human gate, not just to keep thieves out, but it was the only way in. So contrary to what you may hear some high-profile people tell you, there is only one way, and that's through Jesus. And the more time we spend in the Word, the more we learn to instinctively recognize the voice of God and to be able to discern it from voices that would cause us harm and lead us in the wrong direction. You know, Jesus even baffled the guards. They sent the guards to arrest him, and they reported back to the religious leaders and said, "We can't find any good reason to arrest him." And, well, of course, they mocked him. They said, "You're no different than the foolish crowds that follow him. They're just ignorant people." I guess you could say they thought all believers were a basket of deplorables. So now Jesus teaches us something else. And it's a matter that is often discussed today. Have you ever heard the phrase, "Who made you judge?" Is it ever right to judge another? Well, Jesus explains this when the Pharisees bring an adulterous woman to him, quoting law that says that she should be stoned. Now, apparently they failed to realize that they themselves had broken the law, because the law actually said the man and the woman was to be stoned, but they just brought the woman. Now, Jesus, he knew the law, and he didn't say adultery was right, but at the same time, he didn't excuse her sin. Rather, he said, let the one without sin cast the first stone. Because, see, the lesson here is not so much on the person to the person who committed the crime, but for those who judged the crime. He made them look at themselves first. And we should remember that, because as Christians, yes, we're to identify sin, and yes, we're to address it, but only after we examine ourselves first, because then and only then will you have the right amount of compassion and mercy, so that your attention is not so much focused on punishment as it is for restoration. So we're going to continue next week. Jesus is, as we said, is getting close to his end time, and he has a lot of valuable lessons to teach. So next week we'll pick up on that.